So have you ever been sitting in a meeting, listening, taking it in, and suddenly you realize, oh man, I don't even get that. I don't understand. And you know exactly what you want to ask. But then in about 3 seconds, your brain starts ticking and your thoughts start going. And it's like, oh, I should actually know this. Or, man, if I ask that, everybody's going to know that I missed it. Or, I'll figure it out later, right? We just make these accommodations. So you smile and you nod and, act like you know what's going on, but you miss something really probably important, at least for your own understanding. And then you leave and you're still confused. So if you've ever done that, you're in good company. You are not the only one. I promise you that. And today I want to show you something that really changed how I view and experience confidence. Because the people that we admire most in organizations or in our lives, really, they're not the ones that pretend to know everything. They're not the ones that espouse that they know everything. They're the ones who are actually willing to learn and to do that in a public setting, right? That people can see. And once you understand that, then asking those thoughtful questions, the ones that maybe you would be surprised that other people also want the answers to, that stops feeling like so much of a risk. You don't feel as exposed, and you start feeling like that's a way that you can really move yourself forward. And interestingly enough, people often will come up to you and say, gosh, I'm so glad you asked that question. Seriously, that's what we're going to talk about today. All right. Hi, I'm Leeza Steindorf. I work with Fortune 500 companies, state and local governments, and organizations across the globe. And I help people strengthen their communication and navigate conflict and become effective leaders and also relational leaders. And one thing I've learned over the years and across all those countries is that people who really grow the most and who really expand their understanding and their skill sets, they're the people who don't need to pretend they know everything. Like they're the ones who are willing and able to stay curious and to say, you know what? I don't know the answer to that. Or ask questions that are thoughtful, like those ones in the meeting, right? So the people who care more about understanding, about what's going on, learning, they're the ones that really grow. And that's more important to them than protecting some kind of an image. So if you're joining me again, welcome back. If these conversations are useful to you, I'd appreciate you liking the video, subscribe to the channel so you know when new ones come out. And what we're going to talk about is why asking just one simple question can feel so incredibly difficult. All right? So just take a minute and think back maybe to school, either college, high school, elementary, whatever it is. Most of us learned in those school settings that the kids that asked the questions, they got rewarded. Or the ones that asked questions that maybe most people knew, they were laughed at. And the student who answered quickly when the teacher asked a question, man, they looked so great and everybody, gave them accolades. The student, though, who raised their hand with the right answer, more often than not, they got the praise, and the student who didn't get the answer right, they didn't get the praise. And what about the ones that asked a lot of questions? Like always wanted to know more, always wanted to understand. They may have felt like they were slowing things down, or maybe people even made fun of them. So whatever the scenario was, we had training very early on in our relationship to asking questions. And it's curious, you can ask yourself, what is your relationship with asking questions? It might sound odd. Often when you ask questions, people think that they're being judged. They feel like you're accusing them. They might think that you haven't been listening. There's this whole ecosystem around questions. But when we are willing to put ourselves in a place of curiosity and ask questions from that place where it's not going to determine our value, but simply asking questions because we're interested, that's then how we can really show up. But we don't learn that. It's acquired, if we're lucky. What we do learn is that asking questions is risky business. And then we enter the workplace. And then the same story follows us, right? Oh, if I ask this question, they're going to think I wasn't paying attention. Or if I ask this, maybe they'll wonder why they hired me, or if I'm right for this position. Or, man, if I ask, I bet everybody else understands this, but I really don't. Yeah, so we have this whole story, this whole narrative around questions. And it's amazing how quickly our minds can turn one simple question into this threat or risk scenario. And here's what's fascinating. Almost everyone else in the room is managing some version of the exact same fear. That's why people come to you later and say, oh, I'm so glad you asked that question, right? So I've coached senior executives leading organizations with thousands of employees. And I've coached also brand new managers like who were terrified of speaking up in meetings. And what surprised me is that it doesn't matter where you are in that trajectory of your learning, the fear of not knowing and of other people thinking you don't know looks the same. It doesn't matter if you've been in the position of leadership for years or you're just starting out. One worries they'll sound inexperienced and the other one worries that they'll lose credibility. It's a different job title, but it's the same human nervous system. They went through the same thing growing up. They have the same convoluted relationship with questions. And once you begin seeing that, then you can actually start curating and designing how you want to be in relationship with questions. And confidence isn't what we actually thought it was. Or we may have learned that confidence is about certainty, but it's actually about curiosity, being willing and comfortable to be curious. So one of the biggest myths about successful professionals is that they're simply smarter than everyone else. And sometimes they have more experience and sometimes they have more knowledge. I'm not saying that. But that isn't what consistently sets them apart. What does set them apart is that they're comfortable not knowing. They don't get uncertain at not knowing. They don't get shaken not knowing. They don't doubt themselves in not knowing. They're comfortable asking. They're comfortable saying, can you help me understand that? Or how can we look at this a different way? Or what is the assumption that we're making here? Or whatever. I'm not getting this. Can someone explain it to me? I'm sure you've heard that too from leaders in your organization. So those questions don't slow down the conversation. They move it forward or they open it up, right? They invite people to explore and to examine. And that's where real thinking takes place. So think about some of the best leaders that you've worked with. Chances are they didn't dominate every meeting, pounding their fist and saying what they knew. They listened. They asked questions, thoughtful questions. They invited other people to think. Maybe they even slowed down the decision making so that there was more clarity, so that everybody came along in the process, not just a few people. And that's real leadership. It's not weakness and it's not uncertainty. It's really feeling comfortable in knowing and guiding the process. And something happens then when a leader asks those kinds of questions. The entire room relaxes. Everybody's like, oh, because they're taking it as an invitation. They're not taking it as doubting themselves. They're not taking it as the leaders doubting themselves. They're receiving it as an invitation to pause a minute and consider. And that's really useful in an organization that's making decisions and doing business, right? Because everybody then realizes they don't have to pretend. They're invited into this arena of curiosity, of wanting to understand, of wanting to know more. And so then the meeting or the team project or whatever it is becomes more about thinking and not about image or how you're presenting yourself. And that's where good decisions come from. Not from everyone trying to look smart, but from people really wanting to understand and to understand each other and to understand the subject that they're involved in, right? So when someone tells me that they're afraid to ask questions, I'm pretty clear it's not actually the question that's the problem. It's the prediction or it's that thought process that's attached to it, those fears, right? What if they think less of me? What if I sound unprepared? What if I lose credibility or they interrupt my thought process? So if you notice, the thing that actually is in all of that content is it's a prediction about something that hasn't even happened yet. None of those things have happened, but people get afraid that could happen, and then they stop themselves. I believe because when we're younger and we're trained into how do we feel about asking questions, how do we feel about presenting ourselves in groups, how do we feel about being received when we bring ideas? And if that was an uncomfortable situation, that just carries on the longer we go if we don't question it, if we don't take the time like we're doing here in these videos. So one of the concepts that I teach is the difference between facts and the stories that we build around them, the narrative, right? The fact is simple. It's based on something that's measurable. The light is on, it's 25 degrees, my shirt is brown, you're staring at a computer screen or phone screen, whatever. Those are facts. They're measurable, they're observable. If you have a question, that's all you're doing. You're asking a question, right? Everything after that question, that's your interpretation, that's your story. Oh, they're going to think I'm stupid or unprepared, or they're going to regret hiring me, or everybody else understands. Those aren't facts. Those are stories that you've put together, and there's nothing wrong with them, but it doesn't make them a fact. We treat them as though they are. So our brains are incredibly good at predicting embarrassment. Yeah, they really are. It's like the worst case scenario. I can totally work that out in my head. But they're not really good at predicting reality, because we believe those stories and then our bodies react as though they're the facts, as though they're true. And so my invitation to you is to separate those out, because when we believe the story, that filter, as though it were the truth, our bodies get tight, our hearts start to race, we don't share, we stay quiet, and all of this tension comes because of an event that only exists in our imagination. So I'll give you an example. Imagine your team is rolling out a new software system, and you don't understand one important step. And let's say you decide not to ask because you don't feel comfortable with asking. And then there are maybe 3 other people who don't understand it either, but they also stay quiet, like they're not going to ask either. And so 2 weeks down the road, right, everyone's making mistakes. And it's not because they're not capable, it's because nobody wanted to ask that 30-second question. Now that may sound like that's not even possible. I can tell you there are more times than I can count that I've heard about that happening. And so after years of coaching executives and emerging leaders alike, and also teams, whether they're seasoned or they're just coming together, I can tell you something that surprises so many people, and that is that those experienced leaders really appreciate thoughtful questions. They're not going to say, oh my God, this guy's an idiot, or she really should know what's going on. They want to know what's in the room. And every question produces some sort of a thought process, some sort of an answer, not immediately, but a good question, one that you can trust yourself to pose. Yeah. It brings out ideas, or it shares where the loopholes are. It uncovers those blind spots, and it helps everybody that's listening to think more clearly. Either they have an answer to offer, or they're grappling with the same question. And once you begin seeing questions that way, then your presence, how you show up in that room, can also change, because you can be a lot more comfortable that what you're actually bringing to the table is a contribution. And many young professionals believe that their job is to prove themselves. They need to show that they belong, or earn their place, or demonstrate that they have the answers. I don't think that's your job. I think your job is really to bring yourself as you are, and that's the contribution. And that's why a lot of the work that I do is about self-worth and knowing your value just because you're there, and trusting that what you're bringing has value for the group. So sometimes contribution sounds like an answer, and sometimes it sounds like a better question. In fact, one of the simplest ways to earn trust, if you will, is to ask the question that everybody else is trying to figure out for themselves, but nobody wants to say out loud. Like to trust yourself, right? And that takes courage. And courage is a lot more valuable than trying to look perfect. So curiosity is not the opposite of confidence. It's actually the engine of confidence. Yeah, it's where you start to feel strong and stable and grounded in yourself, because you're willing to learn out loud in public. You don't have to protect an image or develop yourself some way. You get to be who you are and bring that to the table and learn as you go. And something else that I've noticed is that people who spend a lot of their time trying to look competent, they actually are the slowest to learn, because they're occupied, right? They're busy with, how do I look? What's it going to be? But the people who are willing to say, help me understand that, or can you explain that to me just one more time? Those are often the people who become exceptional, because they're willing to take that extra time and put in that extra effort to understand, to get it right, to be really, really clear about what's going on. And it's not because they know more. Those people that become exceptional, they become exceptional because they didn't stop learning. So if you've been sitting quietly because you're afraid of asking the wrong question, I hope that maybe you'll just consider whether there is no right or wrong question. There are just useful questions. And that curiosity is really your contribution, okay? Questions don't make you look less capable at all. And thoughtful questions show that you're really engaged, that you're listening, and that you're thinking and you're present. So confidence isn't walking into the room with all the answers. As I said, confidence is really feeling grounded and curious and trusting that the right question is not going to improve your standing, and it's also not going to diminish your standing. It's going to contribute. And that willingness to contribute, that means a lot. So here's something I'm going to offer to you to try out this week. Don't challenge yourself to ask 10 questions. Just ask one, okay? One genuine question. So when you count yourself, when you're in a situation and something doesn't make sense, or you're wondering if these two things go together, or what about that's missing, think about what you want to say and then pose the question. And not to impress or sound smart, but simply because you're curious, you want to understand, and you can frame it that way. I'm really wanting to understand. Can you clarify, please? Whatever it is, yeah? And then pay attention to what actually happens. Not what your mind projected on the situation, but what actually happens in the situation. And I think you're going to discover that the conversation that you're in will become richer because you spoke up, like things start to germinate and bubble up. And you also might discover that someone else in the room is grateful that you asked that question. They may say it out loud, or they may come to you later, because there's a good chance that they were wondering the exact same thing. I can't tell you how often I hear that. So I'm going to say people don't often remember the person that has the right answer all the time, but they do remember people who are engaged and who care enough to be curious and to want to contribute. Okay? So that's my invitation. Try it out. Let me know in the comments below how it went for you, what the scenario was, and if this was useful. And if this conversation resonated with you, I invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you'll know when new ones come out. And then maybe share it with someone else who's maybe beginning their career or finding their voice at work. And if you want to leave in the chat box below, I'd love to hear from you. What's one question that you've been wanting to ask, but you haven't for whatever reason? All right? Because there's a good chance that somebody else has been wondering that exact same thing. So remember, curiosity is not a sign that you're failing or you haven't learned enough. It's a sign that you're alive and you're engaged. And that's exactly what you can bring to the table. Trust your contribution. All right? Thanks for listening. Until next time, be well.